It's Monday, March 21st, 2022. I'm Joshua Claycamp, and this is The Word and Observer, a Kamloops Christian's reflection upon the times in which we live while looking to the Scriptures in order to understand how, as Christians, we need to think and feel about current events. A rather interesting opinion piece came out in the Washington Post over the weekend entitled, "Consent is Not Enough, We Need a New Sexual Ethic" by Christina Emba. I was quite surprised to see this in the Washington Post, but as soon as I saw it, I was immediately praising and thanking the Lord because this is indeed a question that has been brewing for quite some time, particularly in our culture's hooke-up culture in which we live. The article begins detailing the account of two young girls, one named Rachel and the other named Caitlin, both pseudonyms in order to conceal their identity. But as Christina Emba goes on to document these two girls and their experiences, she's careful to point out that these experiences are not isolated to these two young women, but are actually present and a real part of the dating culture for much of the premillennial and Generation Z group that has been living and growing up during the pandemic. Christina Emba goes on to write in her article, young Americans, quote, "Young Americans are engaging in sexual encounters they don't really want for reasons they don't fully agree with. It's a depressing state of affairs," she writes, quote, "turbocharged by pornography, which has mainstreamed even more extreme sexual acts and the proliferation of dating apps, which can make it seem as though new options are around every corner," end quote. And so right off the hop, Christina Emba details the fact that young Americans are having sexual encounters that they don't really want for reasons they don't fully understand, or if they do, they don't agree with. And nevertheless, there is this pressure that is present upon them because if they don't satisfy their partner's desires in terms of his sexual wants or his personal gratification, they feel that pressure that perhaps their partner will leave them because of the proliferation of social media and dating apps, which create the impression that there are other partners just waiting around the corner. Christina Emba goes on in her article to write, quote, "In our post-sexual revolution culture, there seems to be wide agreement among young adults that sex is good and the more of it we have, the better. That assumption includes the idea, though, that we don't need to be tied to a relationship or marriage, that our proclivities are personal, and that they are not to be judged by others, not even by participants. In this landscape, there is only one rule: get consent from your partner beforehand," end quote. And so it is that within the sexual dating landscape, there is a lack of trust, there is a lack of emotion, there is a lack of commitment. Ultimately, though, all of the individuals who are recounted for us in this article who continue to date in this hookup culture in which they feel pressured to have sex do so because they believe that safer options or smoother avenues simply just are not available to them. This is what dating looks like in the 21st century. This is, therefore, what I must do in order to satisfy my partner, in order to continue to explore whether or not this is an individual that I may want to spend the rest of my life with. That is how they're approaching it. That is how they are thinking about it. And as a result, they feel like they must engage in sexual intercourse in order to continue the relationship, in order to keep things moving. Christina Emba in her article goes on to write, quote, "But the outcome is a world today in which young people are both liberated and miserable. While college scandals and the Me Too moment may have cemented a baseline rule for how to get into bed with someone without crossing any legal lines, that hasn't necessarily made the experience of dating and finding a partner simple or satisfying. Instead, the experience is often sad, unsettling, even traumatic." Christina Emba goes on to talk about Rachel, one of her two individuals that she interviewed for this article that were merely symptomatic of a whole host of other individuals. And she goes on to write, quote, "As Rachel told me, every single person I know, every woman I know, has had some questionable encounter, whether it was really violent or really forceful or just "Oh, you know what? I hated that. That was not fun," end quote. In other words, they're forced to have sex, and in the engagement of sex in these dating relationships, they are finding the experience anything other than pleasurable. That in and of itself raises an interesting question. Emba goes on to answer why these experiences are happening the way they happen. Quote, "These are typically encounters that adults have entered into willingly, in part because consent alone is the standard for good and ethical sex, but the experiences that many young people describe to me sound neither ethical nor particularly good. When the COVID-19 pandemic briefly pressed pause on our overheated social lives, many young adults suddenly had time to reflect on their experiences and desires. That is, what we really want from dating, sex, and relationships, and what we want and expect from each other. Today, as we make our way back into the world, we need a new ethic because, as Christina Emba says, consent is not enough. Even when everything goes well," she writes, "sex is complicated. It involves our bodies, our minds and emotions, our connections to each other, and our deepest selves. And despite the many and popular arguments that it's only a physical act," she writes, quote, "it is clear to almost anyone who has had it that sex has vast consequences, some of which can last long after an encounter ends. Over the past several decades, our society has come to believe that consent, as a legal standard and a moral requirement, could somehow make our most unruly activity more manageable, but it was never going to be that easy," end quote. And this is the issue. Indeed, sex involves, as she writes in her article, our deepest selves, and this was how it was intended by God, our Creator. It says in Genesis chapter 2 that God made man and woman, and in describing that process, it is made clear to Adam that when God makes him, there is no other creature on this earth that is suitable for him other than the mate which God will make for Adam. And so as the creation account tells us, God takes the man and he puts him into a deep sleep. He causes a deep sleep to fall upon him. And then from his rib, from his body, he takes a rib, and from that he forms and fashions the woman. Now, all of this is incredibly instructional, and it's helpful for us as we look at the creation account to realize that what God is attempting to do is to give us mates who will actually be individuals we can have a meaningful and deep relationship with. The fact that God does this before there is ever any mention of the two coming together or consummating the marriage is to show that what man needs is a partner. What both men and women need is a friend, their best friend, someone which they can have a meaningful and deep relationship with. And once that relationship has been established by the Word of God, it is then that Adam, having observed his wife, goes on to say, "This at last shall be flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. And man shall leave his mother and his father, and he shall be bound to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." And so in that description, it is clear that there is an order in which these events are to happen. First, it comes from the realization, stated plainly by God, that man is not supposed to be alone. As God says, quote, "It is not good for him to be alone," end quote. And so the idea here is one of companionship, friendship, that they will enjoy each other, that they will want to be around each other. And then after this is established, then we see that they are, once they enter into that marriage union, they are then permitted and encouraged to have that sexual intimacy, which attaches to marriage. In our current culture today, reading these articles and hearing these accounts of these young women feeling as though they are forced, feeling as though they are pressured, feeling as though they have to engage in these activities in order to continue the relationship, in order to discover whether or not they want to continue in the relationship, to have a friendship with their potential partner, is putting the cart before the horse. And it is destructive. And we are seeing the fruits of that destruction play out in our society as a whole. Now, Christina Emba in her article goes on to say that when it comes to consent, when it comes to women and men and women agreeing to these types of relationships, consent is primary. She goes on to write, quote, "No means no was a radical slogan when it was first popularized in the 1990s. Yet, by the 2010s, the preferred consensus had moved away from no means no and coalesced around, quote, yes means yes, end quote. In fact, California enacted a law of the same name in 2014. This phrase and the accompanying idea of affirmative consent made clear that the absence of a no didn't constitute agreement to anything. An active yes was needed. Yes, as the standard, would ideally make the act of giving consent an informed, empowering exchange, or at least that was the idea. Christina Emba goes on to say, quote, even the qualified versions of consent, that is, affirmative and enthusiastic consent, even these qualified versions of consent have the lowest possible standard as their working assumption, which is, did I get permission so that my actions are not statedly against this person's will? The new adjectives are often understood as simply shifting the goalposts. Rather than stopping when your partner says no, you have just gotten them to say yes in the right way. And as she goes on to talk about in her article, this opens the door for all manner of behavior that, even though consented to, is still not ethically correct. She goes on in her article, quote, the problem with all of this is that consent is a legal criterion, not an ethical criterion, end quote. And with that, we have to wholeheartedly agree. Just because two adults have willingly consented to a relationship doesn't mean that it is a good relationship. And just because two ethical and consenting adults have engaged in sexual activity by consent, that doesn't necessarily mean that that activity is good. Christina Emba goes on in her article, she writes, quote, it doesn't tell us how we should treat each other as an interaction continues. Again, she's referencing this idea of informed consent, an enthusiastic yes, as she puts it, doesn't tell us, quote, how we should treat each other as an interaction, a sexual interaction that is, continues. Quote, it doesn't provide a good roadmap should something go off the rails. And it suggests that individual actions, such as ask for consent, speak your mind, be more forceful in saying yes or no, quote, are enough to preempt the misunderstandings and the hurt that can come with physical intimacy. Now, this is a profound article. Every once in a while, you read an article in a major newspaper such as this one that really hits the nail on the head. Just because we consent, just because adults are out there who consent to this type of relationship doesn't make it right, and often enough, it doesn't actually safeguard their hearts, those individuals who are consenting in that relationship. The author of Proverbs, one of the sages of old, one of the wise men of old, wrote, quote, this is Proverbs 4:23, quote, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. And so the sages of old, the author of this particular proverb, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is telling us as Christians, we have to guard our hearts. We have to be sure to take care that we monitor what it is that our hearts are longing for and why it is that they are longing for these things. And we need to monitor them closely because all of life, the decisions we make, the long-term path we set for ourselves, and the direction we go, all of this is established based upon what is happening inside our hearts. And as Christina Emba points out in her article, her opinion piece in the Washington Post, when we make these decisions to enter into sexual, intimate relationships, when we consent, we may have satisfied a legal criterion for having a sexual relationship with each other, and this may satisfy the standards of the law in terms of whether or not your partner can come back and accuse you of abuse or rape. But just because you satisfied a legal criteria does not mean that you have acted in a manner that is actually loving for your partner. You're not necessarily acting in a manner that is loving. But another aspect of this article that made it really remarkable was that Christina Emba didn't just talk to women, she also talked to men to see what their perspective was. And I was quite surprised to read this article in that she interviewed not only women, which is not all that uncommon, but also men, which is extremely rare. She talks to an individual by the name of Michael. Again, this is a pseudonym. And she goes on to ask Michael what his experiences are. And he goes on to detail that, quote, there is a pressure to say yes, which feels more like a pressure not to say no. This individual, Michael, goes on to say that essentially he is compelled to live up to the, quote, callous womanizer, end quote, stereotype that the low bar of consent culture seems to pressure upon men. In other words, what he's getting at here is that if he goes on a date with a woman, the woman also expects that there should be sexual intercourse that takes place in the course of the evening. And if the man does not consent, then he is regarded as being less than a man. And in Michael's perspective, he has to live up. He has to sort of raise himself up to this bar. I would say lower himself to this particular standard. But as the article details it, he has to raise himself up to this bar where he is willing to sleep with someone whom he has just met. And if he does not do so, in Michael's words, quote, he is not living up to the, quote, callous womanizer stereotype that consent culture seems to dictate that he ought to match. Christina Emba goes on in her article. She says, quote, this pressure, men said, made it harder to pursue the real connection that many of them desired. And at the same time, a lack of clear norms apart from consent continued to contribute to an underlying of anxiety and uncertainty. You know, enough not to be like Harvey Weinstein, but what if you end up canceled like West Elm Caleb? Quote, making even low-stakes interactions feel more and more out of reach. Now, I have to be perfectly candid here and just say that in that particular line that Christina Emba writes in her opinion piece, I have absolutely no idea what she means by the reference to West Elm Caleb. But she says that as far as men are concerned, there is a lack of clear norms. They are not familiar with what should be normal or what is expected of them. And all they really understand is that they need to get consent. But in the pursuit of getting this consent, it makes these low-stakes interactions, this is the word she uses, a low-stakes interaction, feel more and more out of reach. For example, men are to be held criminally or legally liable if they don't get consent in just the right way, and they feel pressured to have sex, and they know they have to get consent before they have sex. And so there is now this unbelievable pressure on the young man in question to follow through with the stereotype that is expected of him, which is to pursue a sexual encounter with the young lady, and then also at the same time to make sure he gets legal consent so as to protect himself from accusations of rape or wrongdoing that might occur after the fact. And so if you're a young man just trying to go out on a date with a young woman, in terms of just having fun and getting to know each other, all of that is thrown out the window. And there is, instead of this first date in which we ask maybe 20 questions and get to know each other, there is, instead of that now, this incredible pressure to live up to some standard which is borderline illegal and must now be satisfied by means of establishing some sort of a legally satisfied consent on the behalf of the young woman. Talk about nuts. Talk about crazy. This is nothing even remotely close to the joy and the romance of what God intended when He established marriage between men and women. We as Christians should grieve at this sad state of affairs. We should grieve that this is what it has come to. Now, of course, all of this brings us to the conclusion of the article. Christina Emba begins to wrap up her opinion piece this way. She writes, quote, I asked many of these people what a better sexual ethic might look like. Quote, listening, I heard. Quote, care. Quote, mutual responsibility, some suggested. Or as one woman plaintively put it, quote, can we not just love each other? End quote. The question points to what looks to me, she writes, like a good answer. The word love tends to conjure ideas of flowers, chocolate, declarations of undying devotion, but the term has a longer and more helpful history. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century philosopher and theologian, defined love as, quote, willing the good of the other, end quote. Willing the good means caring enough about another person to consider how your actions and their consequences might affect them, and then choosing not to act if the outcome would be negative. It's mutual concern, thinking about someone other than yourself, and then working so that their experience is as good as you hope yours to be. It's taking responsibility for navigating interactions that might seem ambiguous, rather than using that ambiguity to excuse self-serving misunderstandings, end quote. Wow. Again, I could not help but be just unbelievably impressed by what Christina Emba is writing in her opinion piece in the Washington Post. Unbelievably good writing in this particular article as she brings her opinion piece to a conclusion. She says that in the dating relationship, we should be seeking the good of others. Now, I can't help but go back to what she said at the beginning of the article, in which she documented what sex involves. It is the whole person at their deepest level, at their deepest self. And as she is documenting all of this, she says that what we need to be doing as a society, as she comes to the end, is not looking for legal justification for a sexual interaction, not looking for a legally satisfying form of consent, but really what we need to be doing is we need to be treating each other with love. And that is considering the experience from the other person's perspective and doing what will actually bring them the most joy. I appreciate this writing from Christina Emba, and I completely think she's on the right track, but indeed she hasn't gone far enough. You see, we all are confused about what is going to bring us the greatest happiness. And although she says we need to begin looking at things from the other person's perspective, everybody has a slightly different notion of what would bring them joy and happiness. We are all interesting individuals with interesting desires and interesting preferences, to be sure. But as the scriptures tell us in Jeremiah 17:9, we are also very deceived individuals. Oftentimes, what we think we want is not what we want, but we are convinced of it in the moment. And so she is correct when she says we need to engage in these relationships out of love, but we would first need to stop and ask the question, how do we know what love is? Indeed, the scriptures give us the answer. We have a beautiful definition of love from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, but ultimately it is God who tells us how it is that we are to love. And going back to the account in Genesis chapter 2, the pattern seems clear. It is a relationship first, followed by the bonds of marriage, a lifelong commitment that is established on the principle that we will always seek each other's good, and the first good that we will give to each other is a commitment to be true to each other, to be faithful to each other, to walk alongside each other for a lifetime with God's grace and help until the day we should die. And having made that commitment, that we will work actively for each other's good until death, it is then in the context of that relationship that God blesses sexual intimacy. It is only in the context of that relationship that we can have that kind of deep engagement of the whole self, as Christina Emba touches on in her article, without hurting each other. And so as we think about the relationships in our world today, it's important to understand Christina Emba's article in the Washington Post as touching on a phenomenon that will become increasingly more prevalent. As individuals engage in these hookups, this hookup culture, and wrestling through the idea of informed consent and what satisfies a legal definition of consent and all of this, we need to understand we're descending into moral anarchy. And God's word is good news because it gives us a very clear definition and a very clear understanding of how we can have these relationships with each other without hurting each other. And of course, the only way we can do it is if we will first trust him and take him at his word. But last, as we bring this episode of The Word and Observer to a conclusion, I couldn't help but notice an interesting piece again in the Washington Post from this last weekend, detailing the Russian cosmonauts who have recently landed on the International Space Station. Article begins, 3 Russian cosmonauts blasted off from Earth on Friday morning for the International Space Station, and they emerged from their Soyuz rocket a little over 3 hours later, all wearing yellow flight suits with blue stripes and accents, which are the colors of the Ukrainian national flag, end quote. Now, what are we to make of this? 3 Russian cosmonauts landing on the International Space Station, a international collaboration amongst multiple countries, including the United States and Russia. And these 3 Russian cosmonauts emerge from their spaceship, their Soyuz capsule, wearing colors that are the Ukrainian flag, that make up the Ukrainian flag. Is this something to be understood as a cryptic, perhaps veiled statement of support for the Ukrainians? Is this an act of defiance against their own government, which is currently invading Ukraine? What are we to make of this symbol? Naturally, the cosmonauts were rather vague. When asked about it, they went on to say, quote, we actually had a lot of yellow material, so we had to use it. And that's why we had to wear yellow, end quote. And of course, this particular cosmonaut is detailing that Russian space crews are allowed to choose the colors that they wear from a stock of supply equipment. And of course, they seem to have a lot of yellow that was currently unused in the supply locker, so they determined that they needed to use it. It was a question of what was practical, and since they had so much yellow material amongst their supplies, they decided to have uniforms crafted out of yellow. Is that the case? Well, would we believe that Russian cosmonauts would have the freedom to say that they supported Ukraine? Or would they live in fear of a reprisal from their government if they said that? Could it be that they're masking their real support of Ukraine under a thinly veiled reference to needing to just use up the whatever material they had available to them? We're not sure. We can't say with any absolute certainty. But if it was indeed a statement of support for Ukraine, what a powerful statement of support that it would be. Just looking at it from a distance, the Ukrainians' colored flag has been splattered all over the world in every major media outlet. And the planning for this particular Soyuz rocket mission for the cosmonauts has been weeks and weeks in the making. And you would think that Russia, if they reviewed this equipment and determined it was inappropriate, could have supplied alternate uniforms for their cosmonauts. Indeed, they almost certainly would have, which is to imply that although they did not fully confess their support for Ukraine, it does seem likely that these 3 cosmonauts, launching into space on behalf of Russia, are saying to the world that they support Ukraine. They apparently used a uniform that supported the Ukrainian flag colors, and they snuck this uniform aboard. Somehow it escaped the attention of various administrators at Roscosmos. Indeed, American astronauts looking at this said, quote, wow, just wow. That from fellow astronaut Terry Virts. And Scott Kelly, a former NASA astronaut, also tweeted out, Ukrainian yellow. Well, we should all support Ukraine in these dark, dark days in which their country is being invaded by their neighbor to the east. And we shouldn't be surprised to see anyone with a moral conscience looking at what is happening in Ukraine also standing up in their own small way to voice their support of the struggle for freedom, even if that support should come from an international space station flying 500 miles above the Earth from 3 Russian cosmonauts. Thanks for listening to The Word and Observer. You can follow me on Twitter by going to twitter.com/Joshua Claycamp. For more information on First Baptist Church of Kamloops, go to firstbaptistkamloops.org, or for more information on First Baptist Classical Academy, where we strive to educate kids according to a Christian worldview, just go to firstbaptistclassical.org. I'll meet you again tomorrow for The Word and Observer.